All right, let's call to order the Finance and Administration Committee meeting for March 27th, 2025. Special meeting and also of the Board of Directors. Can I have roll call, please?
Good morning. Director Ranjiv Kush,
Here.
Director Larry Russell,
Here.
Vice Chair Diana Mayer,
Here.
Chair Jed Smith,
Here.
and currently not present is Director Sampson.
Great. All right, today we have a fairly full agenda. We're going to be reviewing two different contracts for approval, or at least for comments for workman's comp and staffing. And then we're going through the financial update, annual review of our Policy 33 investment, which I think is interesting, and some recommended changes, and then budget planning, which is going to be a lot of our work in this committee in the coming years. So I'd like to have a motion to approve the agenda, please.
So moved.
Second.
Great. Any public comments?
There are none.
All right, great. And so a roll call, please.
Director Kush,
Aye.
Director Russell,
Aye.
Vice Chair Mayer,
Aye.
Chair Smith.
Aye.
Thank you.
Great. All right. So now I think we're going to go to our closed session, and we will reconvene afterwards. Thank you.
And there are no public comments.
Okay, let's reconvene our meeting to an open session. Coming out of our closed session, there are no items to report. And we'll move on to, 9:30 a.m. We'll move on to public comment on non-agenda items, please.
There are none.
Great. And then regular items right now, we'll move on to approval of the minutes for the Finance and Administration Committee meeting from February 27th, 2025. Can I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Great. Any public comment on the minutes?
There are none.
And a roll call, please.
Director Kush,
Here. No.
Aye.
minutes.
Aye.
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 Director Russell,
Aye.
Director Sampson,
Yes.
Vice Chair Mayer,
Aye.
and Chair Smith.
Aye.
Thank you.
All right, terrific. So now we'll move on to item 6B, which is a contract extension discussion for the Athens administrators, and we'll welcome our head of HR, Vicki. Thank you.
Good morning, Board. I'm Vicki with the Human Resources Department, and I'm here to request comment on our review for our request to extend a contract with Athens administrators. So Athens administrator is our current workers' comp third-party administrator, and we have a current contract with them that is set to expire in June of 2025, and we're looking for a 2-year extension on that contract through June 2027 with an expected not to exceed amount of $130,000. Athens provides claims administrative services for the district, and they provided good services for us. However, we do plan to participate in the RFP process and do a request for proposal in the next year so that we can benefit from comparing prices and services with other companies. But for now, we would like to extend the contract for 2 years. And expenditures for the 2-year contract are expected to be approximately $100,000, and that's based on past averages. But the actual amount will vary based on claims and the types of claims that we receive over the years. We're also requesting approval of the second amendment to the current contract to cover charges that are through June 2025. And all expected expenses for this contract are in the approved budget. And that's it.
Great.
Comments.
Any comments from the
Where are
board?
they based?
Athens, I believe, well, they're nationwide, but
Yeah, I couldn't ferret it out of their proposal.
yeah, our administrator is in Contra Costa County.
Yeah, I see, 95.
Our contact person, yeah.
And who did this before them?
I don't remember the name of the
don't
company
either.
before them, yeah.
Vicky, how long have we been using Athens in total now?
Looking at the records, it's been about 18 years, so it's time to look.
Yeah, I think it's time to look at other options. 18 years for the work comp provider is a really long time for a single one, and usually rotation here, much quick frequency. So the faster we can go to RFP, even a 2-year extension, I'd prefer not to, but if that's what it's going to take to get the RFP out, then that's good.
They don't really do the workman's comp. They're just a reviewer. We do it.
Administrator.
We're self-insured.
No, I understand that, but it's the process of actually going through how you get an employee treated, all the steps that go through that, that usually there's different services available.
Yeah, they help with the
Yeah.
managed care part of it, yes.
Thank
That's
you.
exactly right.
Great. Any other comments?
Nope, sounds good. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you.
All good. Thank you. Any public comment on this item?
There are none.
Terrific. All right, we'll move on to the next item, which is our agreement for temporary staffing support.
Thank you. So again, I'm looking for review and comment on our request for the general manager to enter into two agreements, or to negotiate and enter into two agreements with Express Employment Professionals in an amount not to exceed 300,000, and Nelson Connects for an amount not to exceed 300,000. And this is to address, occasional need for temporary staffing services. It would be on an on-needed basis. And this would be for, short-term projects, higher demand projects, temporarily backfilling positions and things like that. Again, it's occasional use and on needed. We typically use these firms for administrative support. They're local firms in the area, located in San Rafael and Novato, and they specialize in finding talent in this immediate area. This does not preclude us from entering into contracts with other other firms, but we just want to have these in place in the event that we need staffing support. And this 3-year this is based on 3-year average. The request is based on 3-year spending average for temp agencies.
They actually supply the people,
Yes,
or they find them,
they find the people. Yes.
but then we hire them through them, or?
No, they find the employees, and then they are the actual employer of record, but they come in and
Yeah.
provide us support when we need it.
So for example, and it's touched on in the memo, we have a couple vacancies that we're recruiting for in customer service, but there's a lot of things going on and calls are spiking. So this allows us during that recruitment process to bring in some temps until we have permanent positions.
Are there
That's
any,
an example.
any restrictions on hiring the people they supply? In other words, do they say we can't hire them?
They can apply, right?
Oh,
Oh,
yeah, there is
oh,
a process.
Oh, yeah, when they apply, yes, there is a release fee after a certain amount of time. Yeah. So
You'd have
But
to
it's okay.
compensate them. Yes.
it's okay, yes.
Yeah.
Possible. Can I ask a question? Vicky, what do we do now? We don't have any kind of staffing, outside agency support.
Yes, we do,
Oh.
but we want to get this in place so that we can, if we have a need for it, we can use the
But
services. Yeah.
we've done this in the past.
Yes,
This
we've
has
done this
been
in the past,
unusual.
yeah.
It's-
And with these agencies or other agencies?
With other agencies and these agencies as well.
Is there a max timeline we're using a temp worker in a position to fill?
Yes, because of CalPERS, we cannot exceed 1,000 hours. Otherwise, we have to bring them on as employees. And then with Affordable Care Act, then there's restrictions with that as well.
Okay, but there is a limit to how long we can keep this position temp before we want to fill it full time, or eliminate the temp worker once the need is gone.
Yeah, our goal is always to use regular staff.
Thank you.
And Vicky, just to confirm, so the not to exceed amount would be about 130 over 2 years. So we're spending currently, I think it looks like about 43,000 a year for
Yeah,
temporary.
it's kind of like an average over the 3 years. So one temp, with the limitations that we have, could be about $75,000 just for one person. with those limitations. So we don't use temps a lot.
It
but-
doesn't look like we use them a lot. Yeah. Okay.
Great. Any more comments? Any public comment?
There are none.
Terrific. All right. Well, thank you, Vicky. Have a pleasure having you at our finance and administration meetings.
Thank
And I think
you.
we'll move on to item 6D with Brett Uppendahl,
Thank you.
our financial update.
All right. Good morning, directors. My name is Brett Uppendahl, Finance Director here. This is my first of 3 items this morning. This is the monthly financial update. This will be as of February, end of the year or end of the month, February. So that puts us at exactly 2/3 through the fiscal year, 67%. A lot of these numbers will start to look familiar as they have the last few months as we're here through the winter months. Water revenues, as you'll recall me talking through the last few months, these tend to be higher in the summer, lower in the winter. So we're still kind of riding the above average or kind of ahead of the linear curve so far in the 70% for our water revenues. That'll meet right at the linear line probably next month, and then we'll start kind of coming back up again for the summer. So we're in the basically that's a way of saying we're in the kind of lowest points of the winter here. We're looking back 2 months at these revenues. And you'll see it the next couple slides, kind of the low points of the wet months and the cold months. But all in all, looking pretty good. We're within a couple percent, as I'll talk about in the next couple slides in terms of our overall budget. Bottom line, operating revenue 70% is a nice place to be. A little bit better than we were last year in terms of expectations throughout the year. Capital revenue, as you'll recall, is largely fixed from our capital maintenance fee. So that's a lot closer to the linear trend there, 65%. We also do have grants in that line item when the grants do come in, as well as some smaller connection and capacity fees that have been a little bit lower this year than last year. But all in all, we're in pretty good track, 65%. So good news for the most part through this part of the fiscal year. Expenses have been a little low all year, which has been generally a good thing financially speaking. You can see their personnel services is starting to track closer and closer to the fiscal trend. So that's a good thing. That means we're hiring people and we're getting positions filled. So 62% is pretty much right on track where you do want to be. Maintenance operations should catch up a little bit more over the summer as we start doing some more of our kind of summertime work, although that is much lower than we generally would imagine. That'll also capture water purchases, which have been low this year, thanks to a good rain. And so we're on the lower end of water purchases. So overall 50%. So we will see some savings there by the end of the fiscal year. And then in the coming months, just as kind of a preview here, I'll start to bring kind of year-end projections into this where we think we're going to end the year. So right now being about 2/3 of the way through the year, and I'll talk about it in one of my next items through our budget update. We're starting to hone in on where we think we're going to end the year in terms of savings on the expenditure side and or any kind of revenue impacts. But right now we're looking like we're in a pretty healthy position on both. Capital expenses, those ones had been creeping up in a good way, creeping closer and closer to that kind of monthly mark. This month we're kind of below a little bit. We're at 58%. So I think that kind of just reflects some of the slowdown in construction over the winter time. But all indications are that we're ready for a good spring and a good summer here on the capital side. So I expect that number to come up closer to the monthly trend as we get into the April, May, June timeframe. All in all, though, it's a good balance between revenues and expenses this far through the fiscal year. It's a familiar chart again here, water sales. So this kind of shows you the ups and the downs throughout the year. So actually our next month, if you look at their water sales, so February kind of finishes out this 2-month cycle here, January, February. We actually do have even the lowest month will be next month. So March, you can kind of see the budget there on water sales, 3.9. That's where we expect our actual low to be in terms of overall revenue. So because that's going to be a 2-month lag from January, essentially, right? A 2-month kind of billing lag. So we are kind of the last low month in February here. We'll have one more in March, and then we'll start ticking up towards the summer. You can see the bottom left there, percent of actuals, 97% of expected actuals. So that's a way of saying we're about 3% below the overall budget, where we'd expect to be this time of the year. And that's not a bad place to be. Service charge and watershed fees are smaller amounts. What service charge are fixed. So that's always going to be a little closer to 100%. We're at 98 right now in terms of expected actuals. Watershed fee 97, right in line with water sales where you'd expect it to be. And capital maintenance fee is lagging a little bit this year, but we think that'll pick up later in the year. We'll take a look at some of those budget figures there because that should be a fixed revenue. And so we expect that to be a little bit closer to service charge. And so we'll take a look at that before we end the fiscal year to find out if we're going to be expecting any shortfalls there in revenue. But all in all, 97% across the board for the big ones. And so that's a healthy place to be, as I mentioned.
I just have a quick question on that. Sure. Brett, any learnings you have from these monthly budget to actuals that you might think about changing and implementing for next year or
You know, it's always hard. Every year we take a look at the pattern of usage. I mean, kind of try to modify and get a little bit better. I mean, I think as you may recall, last year we were, obviously really kind of adjusting to the new rate structure. So it was, less known kind of how to expect the ups and the downs. There's always variability. But I think each year we'll tighten it up a little bit, but we're always going to be off a little bit. There's just billing cycle trends, there's weather trends, there's, demand trends. So we're never going to be perfect here. I try not to get too hung up on the ups and downs month to month. You can kind of see, scanning there, we have some months that are surprising, some months that are much lower. Some of that really has to do with how the meter reader team are kind of getting through their month, if they're a week behind or a week ahead type of a thing. And some of these are just kind of natural spikes based on weather. So I don't expect to, I can't promise to get much better in terms of accuracy, but we will take a look at these kind of after that full 2-year cycle. And we'll take a look I think to that point, we start a new, rate study in a year and a half or so. And so we'll take a look at that with a new consultant. We'll kind of get an outside view into this. And we'll try to glean more information than we currently have. But we did a lot of work over the summer to look at the 1-year kind of data set, and now we're about a year and a half into it. So kind of a long way of saying we constantly look at it. We know we're going to be off a little bit, but we're always trying to, improve where we can and get a better understanding for how to project. It's the end of the year I'm really looking at, it's like the month to month can kind of go up and down, but the end of the year
seems
is
to me
where we
like
wanna
the
get to.
low rain months our rates did not impact the low rain. They impacted the low rain months more in terms of increased revenue. And in the high rain months, they impacted them for coming shorter. So it maybe I'm wrong, but
But I
feels
think
like we've been a little bit low on the summer projections and high on the winter projections.
I think that's probably correct. I think in general, I think this rate structure has a better, I would say, floor underneath it, if that's kind of a way of thinking about it, right? I think we're not going to miss the low end as much, and the high end is all going to be kind of based on how they fall into the new tiers. And
Yep.
so I think that's
So
hard
overall,
to
it'll
project
not
it.
average out.
When
Okay,
when we're at
thanks.
the baseline, just tier 1 and tier 2, it's easier to see and easier to project. So I think that's a good way of pointing it. So more to come on that for sure as we get into the final budget discussions. This is the overriding kind of factor here is overall consumption, demand, and we've seen the same trend the last couple of years actually, where gradual increase. This is year to date again through February, so you can kind of see the gradual 3 or 4%, kind of return to, I guess you call it normal, a return to kind of pre-pandemic or pre-drought levels. We're at 15,149 right now. That puts us ahead of where we were, in the low parts of 16 and 17. You can look back there. But it puts us still pretty far behind some of the higher years, the higher consumption years in 18, 19, and 20. So gradually returning back towards the norm. This is where we expect it to be in terms of our rate studies and in terms of our longer term projections. So I think we're in a good place there as well. Kind of that slow and steady return. And then again, this summer will be the final kind of determinant for whether we make our 97% of budget or closer to 100. So more to come in the coming months here. Summary, so we're about 3% below budget right now, overall rate revenues. That's offset right now with expenses being both below budget on operating and capital. We have seen about a 4% increase compared to the prior year in total consumption, which is consistent with our budgeted amount. And then just as of note, in January, the 1 month kind of look of January, we were 1% higher than the prior year, but that's essentially the same as the prior year. So slow and steady here in the wintertime, and we'll kind of turn that into longer term projections in the next coming weeks and months as part of the budget. Happy to answer any questions on the monthly update.
Questions?
I have a philosophical question
Sure.
to start with.
Yeah.
Is there any benefit of the fiscal year that we currently use to the district? As opposed to using a calendar year or even a water year?
I don't know that there's a benefit. I think other than the fact that puts us on the same track as every other kind of local government and every other, agency around here. I think, I'm used to it. Everyone's used to it this way.
Yeah,
It
that's
kind
true.
of creates the kind of the pattern of, kind of really doing your homework and all your final decisions in the spring as it turns into budget time. Um, I think I think the fact that we end our year in the summer is not terrible because you're kind of, getting before the hot months really start to kick in. It's kind of nice to end one year kind of where you expect to be. And then those August, September, October months are kind of into the next year's unknown. So ending the year in June where you kind of know where you're gonna be is somewhat soothing to me at least. So it's comforting just to have a sense when you get to May, I know where I'm going to be in June and July. So other than the predictable nature and the fact that it's similar to the other agencies, I guess that's the main benefit. The rest of it you kind of all adjust to over time if you needed to.
A bit of ain't broke, don't fix, I think also, but
Yeah.
it just seems to me that maybe it's kind of archaic.
Yeah, I mean it's just one of those things. It's most local governments do it. It's kind of a standard to end it right around June 30th there. I mean, I know that there are governments that do the September every year end, right? The federal government. But for grant purposes too, it's kind of nice to be off of that a little bit because it kind of puts you as staggered when you're talking about federal governments and federal audit cycles. So it's nice to kind of finish our local stuff first and then be able to switch to federal cycles after that. Grant awards too. It's nice to be able to have all the accounting done before you have to start getting into the accounting for any of the kind of the funkier ones that come through the federal government or other agencies. So it's just more of a comfort zone for us, I think, at this point.
A more pragmatic question. How are we doing with the delinquent payments?
Um, so we were doing really well for a while because the COVID arrearage payments kind of wiped those out. And so now
Sure.
we're kind of starting to see this, gradual tick back, little by little. We do monitor those on a monthly basis, kind of as part of our standard, analysis. We haven't seen any spikes. It is really kind of a difficult situation because you have to let it go a couple months. There are hardships, there are
To
things
see
that
it
happens in
even,
between.
yeah.
Yeah. And so you really have to get to that kind of, how many are, 6 months late, how many are closer to a year late that really starts to kind of, pique your attention because there's that natural churn on the, 1 month, 2 month, 3 month cycle. So we haven't seen anything yet to really, alarm us, but I think we'll see more of that over the summertime. And typically as you get into more difficult economic conditions, that's when you start to see those spike. And so we've been in a relatively, steady economy the last 2 or 3 years. And like I said, we've had the COVID arrearage payments that have wiped us down to zero, twice in a row now. So we'll be looking at that a lot closer in the next year or two as we get into, collection. And we have a new payment system that's going online too. So it'll give us a little bit more insight into the payments and the reporting. So we'll have a much better way of looking into that in the next 6 months than we do currently.
When the COVID payment occurs, does it wipe out the debt of the individual?
Yes. Yeah. So the requirement of us taking essentially the grant from the state of California was that we had to clear out the individual accounts on an individual basis. So they all got a letter from us saying that their, past due accounts have been, kind of settled by the state of California, essentially.
So in essence, that's taxable income to them.
That's not the way that the grant's treated. It's treated as though they would have never paid it, and then to us, it's just taking away our bad.
No,
debt.
I understand
So,
our
yeah.
side of it, but for their side, it seems to me it's like a real benefit they're getting.
Yeah, it was kind of a part of that stimulus program where it was meant to kind of put money out into the economy or kind of, give people a chance to turn things around. So I guess you could think of it that way, but that's not the way the requirements came to us. It was more of a benefit to us, and we just had to wipe their account clean, kind of.
Do we have any idea what PG&E's situation is on that same issue?
On delinquencies, I do not.
The reason I ask is, I mean, our PG&E bills have been substantial
Hmm.
relative to our water bills. I mean, they're closing in on $1,000 a month for
Mhm.
PG&E.
Hmm.
And, you know, it's a chunk of change compared to the water bill.
Yeah, I have not heard. I haven't heard anything on the PG&E side. We can look into that, but I haven't.
Yeah, I think it would be worth looking into. 'Cause my guess is they parallel or perhaps lead. PG&E knows what's going on because of the magnitude of their bills. You know, not paying the PG&E bill might have an effect on someone's budget. Not paying our bills kind of minimal impact.
Yeah, we'll take a look and see if they provide any reports that we can glean any.
Yeah, I've
insight
never
from.
seen anything them talking about it, and they may not because they're a private company. Maybe
Mhm.
they're, although the PUC probably makes them do something.
There's probably something buried in the reporting that you can probably find. So we'll take a look at it.
Thanks.
Comments?
Thanks, Brett. Good to see the numbers largely tracking, or I think very close to, on a cumulative level, what you had projected when we developed the four-year rate cycle. I thought there was a lot of uncertainty regarding what we would see with water sales, but your projections were pretty spot on a cumulative level. So congratulations for that.
Thanks.
Good. Okay, any public comment?
Yes, Phil Sauter.
Thanks for the presentation and congratulations on outstanding planning and execution of the annual business plan. Month after month, we've had few surprises, and coming from the private sector, that to me is the hallmark of a well-run business. Closer to home, I'm looking at my last water bill, which caught my attention for a couple of reasons. My water use cost me $18, and that was offset by a $16 super saver credit, bringing my net cost of water down to $2 for a 61-day period. And yet my total bill was over $100 and more than triple what I paid 10 years ago. That is not a complaint. During those 10 years, I participated in all the rate hearings and supported all of the rate increases during that time. This isn't the first time I've seen a business with high fixed cost and lower variable costs, and I'm aware that a sustainable business model needs pricing that reflects that reality. But as I mentioned in the last Finance Committee meeting, the thing that's missing for me is any mention of the effect of tiered pricing on our financial results. Getting the tiers right and making sure we're setting tiered pricing at a level that reflects our cost of delivering to those tiers was a major part of the discussions in setting current rates. So I'm surprised that we aren't even looking at our revenue by tier to see how reality is aligning with our forecasts. This data was widely available during the rate setting process, and now it's disappeared, and I'd like to see it come back. And that's not only for financial reasons, but for fairness as well. As we look at large capital projects to increase our water supply, we're also looking at shifting our business model further toward increases in fixed costs, which affect every customer. And that includes the majority of customers who don't use much outdoor water. By the decisions we make here, we're forcing them to subsidize the minority of customers who do use large amounts of outdoor water. Plus, we may be leaving money on the table. If the rates we charge for using large amounts of outdoor water don't reflect the cost of providing it, we still have work to do in adjusting rates so that revenue matches cost. So once again, I'll ask that our next financial summary includes water sales by tier. Thank you.
Thank you. There are no further speakers.
Great, thanks for the comment, and we'll move on to item 6E.
Before we do, I have a quick question.
Yes.
How has the change in the summer allocation, or we don't know that yet?
I mean, we know part of it. So we had last summer to look at that, right? And it's essentially a change in the tier. So the summer allocation just shifts the tiers in the summertime. And I think that was part of the known kind of impacts when we really pulled that, tier 2 down to 15 CCF. So it was below even the original summertime tier. And again, that matched the kind of the user profile, that matched the demand curves. And that was a big part of the rate study, was looking into exactly matching the cost of water, at the low end and the high end, and matching that for what it costs us to provide it. So I don't know the exact number answer to your question right now in terms of the summer tier, but it was a part of that overall shift towards capturing the first base use, in the under 15 tier, which essentially kind of went against the idea of a summer allocation. So it's kind of more philosophical change, wholesale, again, saying this first 15 CCFs, no matter when you use it, is kind of the core cost of providing the water, and then everything above and beyond that goes towards the higher water users.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Larry. Item 6E, our review of our policy number 33 and investment options.
Alrighty, so I'm joined here today by Greg Plum. He's our financial management analyst. He's done a lot of the legwork on this item and many items that you typically see on the Finance Committee. So today we have an investment policy review. And so just to provide a little context, we have existing policy, number 33, which is the district's investment policy. We've had it around since 2009 as far as the current version goes. By statute and by our own policy, we review it with the board once a year. So you may recall me coming once a quarter. That's another kind of provision of this policy as we report out the investment, returns and any issues that we see once a quarter. And then once a year, we're required to do a more in-depth review and bring it to the board for consideration. We have not made any recommended changes in the last 3 years to this overall investment policy. This year, with the assistance of Greg, we've taken a much deeper look into it, and we've also compared it to other agencies here in our local area, and as well as kind of taken a line by line look at how it compares to the current California government code. And you'll notice in the staff report that I submitted, as well as you'll hear us talking about it today, the state of California annually produces what's called the local agency investment guidelines. So it's produced by the state controller's office. It's a kind of annual look at any change in federal and state legislation, any change in best practices, and they try to incorporate and kind of provide guidance to every local agency, not just special districts, but cities, towns, and any other local agency. So Greg and our team did an in-depth look at that this year just to find out where we stack up compared to what the state of California is recommending. And we have a couple observations to share with you here today, and I'll run through those. But kind of to take a step back here, our current board policy is based on government code, section 53601, which really tells local governments which types of investment instruments are permitted for local agencies and provides limits, top end limits for how much any local agency can use within each area. This, as I mentioned, is a required annual review per that government code. And I think the main things that I like to keep in mind here is the objectives of our investment policy is to, number one, maintain safety, meaning we don't want to have a loss of principal, liquidity, meaning we want access to our funds when we need them. Return on investment is something we look at. We definitely want to make sure we're being wise and prudent with the district's funds, with our ratepayer funds. So we do want to make sure we're getting some level of return. But that's listed third there on purpose behind safety and liquidity as the third priority for a reason. And then part of that reason there is public trust is the overriding kind of goal here. Is we want to make sure the public trusts us with their money. And we, our primary core of business is providing water. It's not, making money in the investment market. So we want to be prudent investors. We want to do a good job with the customer ratepayer money. But trust, safety, and liquidity are always kind of top of my mind when I look at this here. So what does that kind of translate to when you kind of think about what does that mean in the investment world? And what we're talking about here is essentially our reserves, right? Our fund balances. So, you've heard me talk about our reserves and where we're at in terms of our overall cash balances here. When we have that sitting in our accounts, we want to, at least put it to work so we're not losing to inflation and we're not losing purchasing power over the long term. But Greg put together this table here, or put it here in this presentation, what's telling us this is what we're allowed to do by government code as comparison to all the investment options you may hear about, on TV or in the newspapers or in your personal life. And so you can see here the list of kind of investment securities there down the left of that table. There's quite a few, obviously, and 2/3 of them are prohibited by California government code. We couldn't even invest in those if we wanted to. You start getting higher up the list there, and you can see there are, the safety, the more safe securities there in the top white box starts to be permitted. Some of them on much shorter terms, and then as you get safer and safer underlying securities, then longer and longer terms are allowed under government code. But you can start to see that the government code is intended to keep local agencies and local governments really in the safe space of again, preservation of principal and, very known, very kind of straightforward and safe investments. So as the summary here tells you, permitted investments tend to be high rated securities, fixed income, what's not permitted or anything that's less than investment grade, anything that's more than 5 years in term, and then equities and derivatives are not permitted as well. So it's really kind of intended to keep us really kind of on the straight and narrow and safe investment spaces. So district policy versus government code. And so as I mentioned, our district policy is generally in alignment with code. It's based on, the code in general. We do not include all of the permitted investments that are available out there for a variety of reasons, and we'll start tracking through those. We definitely have a more stringent kind of set of requirements for certain investment types, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Currently, as you may recall from my quarterly investment reports, we really only have our funds in two different places right now. We have them largely in LAIF, the local agency investment fund. We've been using them for years. It's a kind of a great way to have passive investments, and they take care of all the management fees. They move the money around, to prudent places. We're making about 4.5% in LAIF right now, so it's a great place to have our money currently. There are some limits on how much you can have in LAIF. And so once we kind of start reaching those limits, we need to explore other areas. Right now, the other area that we do have funds in is our money market mutual funds, which again is very safe, short-term securities, very, no loss of principal. And we're making pretty good returns on those now. So we're kind of in a high rate environment. So both of these are doing well for us. We have no problem with these two areas. But we do want to start looking, kind of planning into the future. When rates start to go down, it's not so easy to make 4.5% in these passive investments. We want to start to think about what other options are available for us. This is a chart put together here by Greg again, kind of showing, going down the investment types on the left. Those are the ones that we specifically allow in our district policy. Starting from the top, U.S. Treasury, agency obligations, state obligations, bankers acceptance. So I'll just kind of really safe, short-term type of investment vehicles. On the left there, government code. In the center here, government code and what we could allow under California government code. And over to the right there is our current district policy. And so Greg's highlighted in green the areas where we are more restrictive here at the district than we have to be, or than the government code would generally allow for us. So in many of these areas, you can see here, we're just kind of putting a little bit of, maximums on the portfolio. So, where the government code doesn't require you to have a maximum on state obligations or California agency obligations, we're putting 20% as the cap there, just to make sure we're not putting all of our eggs in one basket. You start scrolling down the list there. You look into, CDs and repurchase agreements. There's more limits there on the overall portfolio. Non-negotiable CDs there, 180 days we have as our maximum maturity, when you could have up to 5 years in the government code. So we start to be tighter and tighter there. Towards the bottom there, money market mutual funds. Currently, we have a 10% maximum percentage of our portfolio. Government code has 20%. So that's something we'll talk about here in a couple of slides. We may want to consider modifying. And then I think LAIF is actually all the same there, right? Yeah, LAIF is the same. These are the investment types that we're currently not including in our district policy. So it's a pretty long list you can see there of things that we currently don't specifically approve in our district policy. So in most of these areas, we're not really necessarily interested in adding them because we wouldn't necessarily use them to begin with. But it is worth noting that in many of these areas, we could use these investment vehicles if we wanted to change our policy to allow that. I'll point out two here, they'll come on the next couple slides. So right in the middle of their mutual funds, our policy only allows us to do money market mutual funds, not kind of more broad mutual funds. And so we have this listed as a not permitted currently in district policy. And then 3 more down from there, I guess that's 4 down, joint powers authority pools. Those are also a common investment kind of vehicle that we don't currently allow within our district policies. So those are 2 that I'll start talking about here in the next few slides. And that's exactly where we're considering recommending updates to the district policy. So some of the limits that, as I mentioned in the 2 slides ago, we would like to consider revising those. And we'd also like to consider adding some permitted investment vehicles just to provide the district with more flexibility in the medium to long-term investments. And as we start to kind of anticipate more of a low rate environment in the next 2 to 3 years, we like to start kind of exploring our options in these areas. So the first place we'll talk about is the money market mutual fund limit. As I mentioned, currently our policy limits us to 10% of our overall funds. California government code allows up to 20%. And I would also mention that we did look into some of our local agencies around here, County of Marin, East Bay Mud, City of Santa Rosa, and County of Sonoma, and all their money market mutual fund limits are consistent with government code, meaning the 20% limit. I believe East Bay Mud was a little bit less. They were at 15%. Mutual funds, as I mentioned, we don't currently expressly allow any mutual funds other than money market mutual funds. So I think there are some in there we want to probably open up our flexibility there for. I mean, obviously, we would still stay in the permitted investments and the safe kind of underlying vehicles there, but I think we would like to have some language that starts to open us up to just normal kind of safe mutual funds. And then joint powers authority pools, I have a couple slides on that coming here. That's something just not mentioned at all in our current policy, and I think we would like to explore adding that as a permitted fund type, and I'll talk about those here in just a minute. So money market mutual funds, this is kind of more of an overview into that. We currently have 16 million in a Fidelity money market mutual fund, very low risk, high liquidity investment. Fidelity is obviously a well-established in investment house, 224 billion in net assets. There are other options there we can go to if we want to go to Schwab or Vanguard or T. Rowe Price. They're all very similar, underlying investment vehicles. Typically, they're only investing in T-bills and other, short-term investment types. You can see the current composition there on the right. Government repos are the big, 48% or so. Floating rate securities, T-bills, kind of round out the majority of where they have their dollars invested. And one thing, as I mentioned here, is we want to consider adding mutual funds to the list of permitted investments here, which will allow us to kind of have a little bit more medium-term kind of mix within this, and not such a short-term look. And then at the bottom there, as I mentioned a couple times, we would like to explore increasing this limit to match our government code of 20%, just to kind of lift the cap a little bit in this kind of safe investment space above our current 10%. Any questions on money market mutual funds, or money market or mutual funds before I get off on this one?
It seems like a good idea to explore this option.
It also seems a little bit artificial to me in our thinking that we have more restrictive numbers than the state. I don't know what the basis of that would be. My first thought is tummy rubbing, but maybe it's more sophisticated. I'm trying to remember if any of those were discussed since I've been on the board, and I'm not quite sure. I think it's logical what you're doing here, and I think we should give serious thought to being in compliance with the state to the extent we can. There's no sense in being arbitrary, in my thinking.
It makes sense to me. I thought it was state government was 30%.
States.
And we're at 20%.
It's 20% combined.
So on this table here, so for money market mutual funds, the second to last item there. So money market.
Okay, I was looking at the CDs. Yep. Okay, got it. Thanks. Sure. Makes sense.
I have a question too. The 75 million for LAIF, that's from them or from us?
That's a LAIF cap. Yeah. So just to kind of open that up a little bit, they have a $75 million limit per account. And so if we were to take bond financing in the future and have money to hold, we could open a second account just for the bond financing. So we could have our own kind of district funds in one account, and we could have a bond financing account separately. So if we had to kind of hold funds for a year or two as we're getting ready for the project, we could open a second LAIF account. Okay, so money market mutual funds there, joint powers authority pools. So these are investment vehicles that are established by local government entities to facilitate public entities pooling their funds for investment. So it's typically used by smaller special districts, smaller cities, smaller towns. It's basically a way to, like it says there, to pool your funds together so that you're not having to each and every one make local investment decisions. They're managed. They're similar to LAIF, as the next bullet says, or other county investment pools where they hire outside professional advisory firms to actually make the investments. They have board of directors that oversee the policy and the quarterly investment returns. There are 3 current alternatives that we could choose from within the state of California. One is called CAMP, the first one there, California Asset Management Program. The second one is called CalTrust. And then there's a third one there that was recently added called the California Cooperative Liquid Asset Security System, or CLAS. That's a much newer alternative that we'll talk about here on the next slide. But
You have to join the JPA to use it?
Yeah, so there would be kind of, paperwork, and they have to accept you, and you have to kind of go through the process there to become part of that JPA to be able to use it, yes. But the first step would be allowing it under our policy. So the consideration would be allowing this overall investment vehicle under the policy, and then it'd be selecting which of the 3 to go for, and then obviously selecting how much to invest within each. Within each, here's kind of an overview. CAMP has been around since 1989, CalTrust 03. As I mentioned, California CLAS is much newer, 2022. CAMP uses PFM for their asset manager. CalTrust uses State Street Global Advisors. And California Class currently uses public trust advisors. Camp is much larger than the other two, as you can see, 19 billion currently in their portfolio. CalTrust, has just short of 5 billion overall. They do have kind of a more short-term liquidity fund, as well as medium-term funds that you can look into. California Class is a little bit different and much smaller. They're in the millions instead of the billions. In terms of overall quality ratings, they're where you'd expect them to be, AAAs and AAs across the board. So that's obviously, established by their charters. And management fees are all very similar. We're looking at, 0.1, 0.6, 16 basis points or so. Within CalTrust, you're going to pay a little bit different management fees depending on which investment type you choose, but it's all still relatively in this, around 10, 12 basis points for each of the different investments. So that's very comparable for what we get in LAIF and certainly what we do for our money market. So that's not much of a concern there in terms of management fees. I think the idea that here we would just be looking for security and for convenience and for, generally kind of proven return in these areas. So if you're looking into kind of the different places that we would consider probably, putting in the district's money, Camp has two different options for us, cash investments or term investments. The cash investments are, 60 days weighted maturity, very similar to currently what we have in our money market fund. So government repos, bank deposits, commercial paper, stuff like that. Term investments put your maturity out a little bit longer, so you'd expect a little more return. So your, 60 days to 1 year would be more of the kind of maturity terms there, but still kind of largely that high liquidity, short term kind of safety in terms of government obligations, repos, bankers acceptances. This one will have more certificates of deposits and commercial paper that gets you that longer maturities. CalTrust has three options there: liquidity, which will be kind of the same as that short-term cash, less than 60 days type maturity. CalTrust short-term investments start to get you a little bit more return. If you're looking at more kind of underlying U.S. Treasuries, money market funds, corporate notes, 1 year or less, typically in short term. Then medium term, as shown there on the bottom, is typically one to 3 years. I think it's 1.5 to 3.5. That gets you just into some of those longer term, U.S. Treasuries and any kind of government agency notes. So those will be, again, more important in the, coming years when you're looking to kind of get out of this super low rate environment. We're looking to kind of make sure our money is keeping pace with inflation, gives us more options there. Any questions on this slide here before I wrap up in terms of the actual portfolio? No.
So just Brett, the point with the joint powers authority pools is just to expand our options.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I guess just to kind of be pretty clear about it, we do currently have, a whole list of options and we're only using 2 of them. When, Greg and Shelley and I look at all of our options, a lot of those require a lot more active management. They require us to hire an outside, advisor or a broker. We would have to start dedicating a lot more staff time to kind of really looking at these each and every day. That's not really our core business. And so this allows us to kind of use the expertise of others and kind of pool our investments with a much larger overall kind of group. So similar to what LAIF currently does for us. LAIF does exactly that. We're just, reaching the limits there with LAIF. And so this is kind of another way to do that with kind of known security and kind of we're all in the same boat in the sense of we all want to have safe and liquid investments and, obviously transparent to the public. And it's something that we don't have to actively manage. And so we can just kind of be a part of the JPA, let them do kind of the financial expertise work. And then we can have, more return and more options than just in our money market accounts. And it kind of still keeps us out of having to actively manage or pay for a broker or kind of have that stuff on our responsibility list. So it seems to be a good mix. A lot of agencies currently use them. It's not uncommon at all. And I'm actually surprised that we don't have that currently as an option for us because the other options start to get pretty complicated pretty quickly. And I feel like this is probably just the best way to go in terms of, being prudent with district funds, getting a good return for our funds and keeping the risk very low.
Got it. Thank you.
Of course, it might be a good investment to get more active involvement.
Yes, that's very true. I mean, I think that you're always kind of looking at that trade-off and certainly as you start to get much larger, like the county of Marin, or you start to get to these, much larger pools, then it becomes, you're better off managing it yourself. You're better off kind of wading your toes into some of the more, risky investments. You're talking about mortgage-backed securities at that point. You're talking still safe, but things that require a little more attention, a little more active kind of turnover, portfolio management, keeping them weighted maturities and all that kind of stuff, online. So I believe currently the County of Marin has a staff of, I think, 6 in their Treasury Department. And so that's what it takes each and every day for the reporting functions, for the accounting, to keep everything straight. And then just to kind of make sure you're doing, right by your customers, your taxpayers' money in that sense. So we're not quite there yet. I mean, maybe there'll be someday where we want to kind of go into that area, but I think at this point, the passive kind of, low cost on our side and kind of high predictability is still best for us. But you're right,
I
there may be
remember working for Monsanto that they had 2 people full-time who invested the difference between their checking account and their what they're going to write and what the balance is versus what they're going to write the next day.
Yeah.
And they did short-term investments, which were quite lucrative for Monsanto.
It can make a difference. It can, if you want to be that active in it. Yeah, definitely.
I remember also Larry Bragman talking at length about Fannie Mae. Do you see a pathway there, or?
Personally, I don't. I mean, I think that was, if I'm recalling, that was probably, 2012, 13, 14, 15. So we're
Yep.
probably coming out of the recession, and
Yep.
it was, low, super low rate environments. And so at that time, I would assume that was probably assumed to be one of the more safer ways to get a little bit more return, coming out of that. At this point, there's been enough risk and enough default in the housing markets and everything else. And I feel like it's probably not something we want to jump into right away. It seems like an easy way to go because it's government backed, but I think these type of investments, at least at this, this market time, get you comparable return for no risk. And, it's a much easier investment vehicle to get into than would be.
I will remind the board the information they don't have. We lost $1 million on the Lehman Brothers, which were considered passed all these criterion, all gold plated, gold standard, and we still lost $1 million. So even when you do your best job, there's still risk.
Sounds good. Any more comments? from the group?
Just to
Yep.
thank you for both you guys for
Yep.
putting this together. It's another step towards modernization to upgrade. So it's good to see. It's good to see the constant touches. I fully support moving these into our portfolio. And, but if we're going to move on one, it would be good just to get a little bit more information about each one, like who participates, how much they're participating, things like that.
Yeah, we definitely can provide that. The idea here was I wanted to make sure we got some good feedback from the board, any kind of general senses. The idea I think would be to come back with more of a red line, more detailed in April to the finance committee. So you can see how the policy would change in a red line type format. And we're happy to bring back much more information on, especially the JPA pools. So we can kind of go into that in more depth. But we just wanted to get an initial kind of feel from the board this time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the review. Very supportive. Appreciate the work. Any public comment?
There are none.
Terrific. We'll move on to item 6F, their budget planning update.
Okay. Whoops. All right, budget planning update. This is my final item for today. So you'll recall last month we did a kind of first pass at the budget planning updates. We talked about some of the context from last year's budget cycle and where we're starting to see the next budget end up. I have one kind of next step into that this month with starting to look at some of the larger expenses that we have coming our way. And I wanted to provide the board some background here for some of what I call, they're not fixed costs in the sense that they're actually fixed, but they're non-discretionary in the sense that we don't get to control the costs for these. And there are some large line items in our budget. So I did just want to provide the board with some background on these items and start to get us ready for what will be in the next 2 months of really talking about the departments and the division budgets here. But I'll kind of go through the district's budget process again, kind of an overview. Then, as I mentioned, I'll start talking about 2 or 3 of the larger non-discretionary cost estimates as they kind of start to provide the background and the backbone for our budget going forward. And then we'll talk about where this will end up in the next couple months in terms of next steps. So we have technically turned the calendar to spring last week, right? March 20th, March 21st. We are in spring now. So I've moved the yellow arrow over one from winter to spring. So we finished up our division budget meetings there in the winter. We've kind of met with all the departments and divisions, trying to determine where the emerging needs are, if there's any proposed enhancements, if there's any kind of unanticipated expenditures coming our way. Now we're beginning the process of prioritizations district-wide, so we're starting to kind of weigh the needs between the departments, and starting to look at, what we may have capacity for. We're also starting to fold in, as we'll talk about here, some of these kind of known fixed costs or kind of known unavoidable, non-discretionary costs into the budget. We'll be finalizing revenue projections in the coming weeks. This last month's revenue really helps kind of push us there. We'll probably wait till May to fully finalize those when we start to see this beginnings of summer, but we'll finalize revenue projections in the next coming weeks. And then in the early summer, meaning in June, we'll come back to the board with a budget study session or kind of, talking through the operating budget with everybody, as well as the budget adoption. So those will be coming our way in the next coming weeks. A little bit of a recap here. So we have a 2-year budget process. In between that, we do a mid-cycle review. That's what we did last summer. Within our 2-year budget process, we have a 5-year capital plan. And so Alex and the engineering team will be coming next month, I believe, to give you a preview of the capital plan. We do a 5-year plan so we can make sure we're, identifying all the projects over the next 5 years, but the board will be approving 2 of those specifically. So you approve 2 years budget and then kind of the 5-year overall plan when that'll come your way. So you'll see that again later April for the first time. Our total current budget in the current year is 163.8 million for both operating and capital. Of that, about 100 or 110 million is our operating fund for our day-to-day operations and our debt service. And our capital fund is currently about 50 million, and that includes regular CIP projects as well as our water supply enhancement projects and our vehicle and equipment replacement. So I put this here just so you have context when you start to see the dollars coming your way in the next couple of slides. You get a sense for what % of the budget we're talking about. When we talk about our current expenditure budget, 164 million, you can see here, I think I condensed these groups a little bit from last time, but you can basically see, you can kind of look at it in thirds, right? So capital and debt service on the bottom left there is about 1/3 of our budget. Operations and materials, top left there, 28% or so, around 30% of our budget. And then personnel services, our people, is another third right there on the right-hand side, around 60 million, 36%. If you kind of break out our personnel services, we're looking at salaries, retiree obligations, and health insurance. Salaries obviously being the bulk of that, but we do have some pretty sizable numbers there for our health insurance and for our retiree obligations. So within that personnel services, as I just mentioned, the 3 big categories: salaries, health, and retirees. For salaries, or future salary adjustments for our staff here are already outlined in labor contracts. So the board may recall that we have a 4-year labor agreement, and so we already know what our COLAs are going to be for fiscal year 25 and 26. That was based on the San Francisco CPI reportings in December. And so the current, and then under the current labor agreement, that's at the San Francisco CPI plus 0.75. And so we had a pretty low reading on the CPI in December. So if you put that all together, that makes a 3.1% COLA for salary adjustments in the coming year. That'll be as of July 1st. When we get into the second year of our budget next year, that'll be 26, 27. We don't know what the CPI is, but the labor contract outlines that it'll be whatever the CPI is. We don't have a plus 0.75 for fiscal year 26, 27. It's just a minimum of 2 or a maximum of 5. So the 2 and the 5 range has been kind of throughout the 4-year contract. And then, like I said, for the second year of our budget, it'll just be straight up whatever the CPI is in December. That'll dictate the COLAs for that second year of the budget. So we know what it is in the first year, and we know the range it'll be for the second year.
Brett, any idea what 1% would do to our budget in terms of the increase to the salaries? When you say 2 to 5, if it's 2, what's the difference between that and 3?
So regular salaries you see here on the right is 30 million, right? So 1% of that is typically 300,000 or so. Then you add the kind of the overhead rates to that. So I typically think about 500,000 or so as 1% of our budget.
Thank you.
In my mind. Health insurance has been increasing the last few years, especially. Health insurance tends to have these kind of waves of low 2 to 3%, and then all of a sudden you get this couple years of 7, 8, 9%. But this last year, health insurance increased across the board by about 9% on all of our plans. And so The board may recall, we, offer health insurance through CalPERS. And so our employees can choose, any of the plans that are currently offered through CalPERS. And we contribute our percentage of the premium based on the middle of those plans. So the median or the middle of all the plan premiums, that's our contribution level. This year, our contribution level did go up by around that 9% or so. So what that does to our budget next year is that it has about a $400,000 impact. We always expected to go a couple percent up, so I would say we expected about 200,000 increase, and we're seeing a 400,000 increase. So that starts to go into some of the balancing issues. Some of this is much more impactful over the long term, and so kind of a 1 year blip here is not the worst thing to worry about. It really is kind of more the 2 or 3 years in a row. But for planning purposes for this year, we are seeing about a $400,000 increase in our overall health insurance costs.
Brett, is that driven by any one particular provider within the suite?
So we are, I want to say about 75% of our employees do Kaiser. And so Kaiser really is the big mover for us. But as I mentioned, the current labor contract we have requires us or kind of commits us to providing the median. So some years it may be that Kaiser goes up a lot more than others, but it doesn't change the median. This year it just happened to be that everyone's went up by about 8% across the board. So our median also went up. So this year we didn't get a break and kind of right down the middle, but sometimes it can be a little bit mismatched.
Thank you.
So retiree obligations are another kind of big piece of the overall personnel budget. We have about 400 retirees. And so you may recall we have about 250 positions in the budget. So we have more retirees than we do actual active employees. For retiree healthcare, that's one of our larger expenses. We established our OPEB trust in 2009. OPEB stands for Other Post-Employment Benefits. So it's kind of another acronym for retiree healthcare typically. We established a trust in 2009 to begin pre-funding those benefits. That trust has grown to over $47 million as of December 2024. We've made about 7.2% on that trust balance since inception. So it's been a good use of district funds. That's gotten us into a good place to be able to provide funding, in perpetuity for these healthcare benefits. We get an actuarial analysis every 2 years to help us determine how much to contribute and how much we should be expecting in future years to contribute to the healthcare trust. They did the last actuarial for us in June of 2024. And in that, it showed us about $4.1 million will be required in 25-26. And that's really consistent with how it's been over the last 6 or 7 years. I'll talk about that in just a minute here. It's been pretty steady, and so it's been a good thing for financial planning purposes. And that $4.1 million requirement is a combination of paying cash payments out to existing retirees to keep their premiums funded, as well as putting money away into the trust so it can grow for future obligations.
Brett, the contributions to this trust, is that included in our personnel services budget?
Yes. Yeah, it's all kind of.
And then do we have a similar trust for pension liabilities?
Yes, in a certain sense. So, I mean, they definitely keep our assets on, they segregate our assets and account for them separately within CalPERS. And I'll talk about that in a minute here. Within CalPERS, you're required to fund. So it's not really a trust fund per se. They just take your money and they require it of you. So it's an obligation you have to do. The OPEB trust here is a voluntary trust, so you don't have to do this. It's obviously best practice, and almost every agency does it now. It was a big push in the mid 2000s to get everyone to start doing this because they realized that the growing costs were really going to be a financial burden for all public agencies. And so this trust is much more, it is discretionary. Once you commit to it, though, you do commit to funding the actuarial required amount. So we each year we sign off that we are going to fund the full amount as determined by an actuary. So, the contributions are less discretionary, if you want to kind of maintain your funding status. But it still does kind of give you a little bit more flexibility. With CalPERS, it's just they require it and you have to do it and you can't really touch it after that. So I think that maybe explains it a little bit different.
Yeah. And when you say we're now required to fund the full amount every year, the actuarially determined amount, that's the amount that's going to be dispersed within that fiscal year?
Well, so you commit to it. You say we plan to fund the full actuarial required amount because that's important to the credit markets and the bond, rating agencies that you're upholding your commitments because they're looking at the long term, they're looking at your long-term liabilities, and they want to make sure you're funding the proper level every year. Because if you start not funding it, then they start to get nervous that there's either something going on or that you're going to have a huge liability in the future. So it's more of a commitment to the overall rating agencies market than it is to anything else. Our primary commitment, our only binding commitment, is to pay for the labor contract that we have, which is to pay the premiums of our current retirees. And so pre-funding is not required legally. It's just required in the markets and our overall kind of credit rating and our reputation, essentially, for funding on schedule.
And I think in the next slide, you're going to show us where we are with respect to.
Exactly. Well, so this slide just shows us the history of the trust. And so, as I mentioned, we started in 2002 with a $2.2 million contribution, and each and every year we've been making contributions. I would say the swings in this are largely attributable to the market, right? So once it's out here, it becomes kind of a market-driven kind of a fund balance. Over the long term, it's been to our favor. And you can see mostly been, we're contributing money into this. So we're adding funds each year, and the market kind of takes it up or down from there. You can see 2021 was a huge boon to us. And that was essentially kind of the back end of COVID when everything was really kind of bouncing back that year, right? So we got a huge gain in 2021. And that gain was reversed in 2022 as things kind of even out. And now we're kind of back on a steady track at just over 41 million at the end of 2023. We're 67% funded as of 2023, which is a pretty, normal place to be for most public agencies. So we're on a good track there. I think one of the things you have to keep in mind here is that when they, look at these, annual funding, it's as of June 30th. So it's not like it's this like long-term balance. It's really kind of a snapshot June 30th every single year. So it's one of these, you don't really know until the last couple weeks of June where you're going to end up at in these areas, right? You can kind of have a great year all year. You're looking around in the market, and then all of a sudden, the last 2 weeks before June 30th, things can change dramatically or for the good sometimes too. So some of this is, you have to take it with a grain of salt and look over the long term. They do provide us kind of a smooth look at this within the reports if you want to take an actuarially smooth look at where the fund balance is. And so I was going to put that here, but it's less less interesting to look at because it's all smoothed out. So in general, this is kind of more of the way that the actual cash balance looks within our fund. But I think it's a good news story here is that the district committed back in 2009 to begin funding this. Now we have $40 million in the bank with which to make sure our retirees will, get their retiree health payments, the premium payments. And we're on a good track to continue that, going forward. So it's generally good news.
Brett, when we say it's 67% funded, does that mean that, if we stopped contributing now, that 40.9, if it remained constant, which it won't, but if it remained there, we could cover 67% of our projected OPEB liability for a certain amount of time, right?
Yeah. So it's definitely a rolling calculation. And so I think they basically say, if we took all your retirees and all your active employees and project out how much that's going to cost over the long term, and then your asset balance, how much that's going to grow over the long term, they find this gap of, about a third. And so it's not quite as straightforward to say 67% as of right now. If we never had an employee again, I think that's the idea is if we stopped working and 67%, you could let it run, for all the expected retirees. But we know that we're in a, perpetual business here. We have a long-term life. So it's really just kind of a measure of making sure you don't fall too far behind because then, you have to start contributing more. And you don't want to necessarily pre-fund. You don't want to get over 100% because you want to let the market do its work, right? Because this is intended to be a combination of cash payments plus the growth over time. And so there's kind of a balance there where you want to be in a good funding area, but you don't want to be over 100% necessarily because it's kind of putting too much aside and not letting the market do its work. So,
is there a recommended place that we'd like to be?
I think when you fall below 50%, it gets a little bit worrisome. And you'll see that in the actuarial because the actuarials are always trying to get you back around to that 30-year horizon to full funding over 30 years. And so they'll start cranking up your contributions if you get too far below. But it's really, anywhere between 60 and 80 is kind of like the, nice zone to be in. Some agencies, if you have extra money, like to be between 80 and 90. But, I think there's not really any guidance other than to say, don't fall too far below the 50% mark. And you don't want to be above 100% necessarily on purpose. I mean, if you have a great market year, that's fine. That's what happened in the early 2000s was, the dot-com boom put everyone over 100% in this area. And then everyone scaled back on their contributions and decided not to contribute for a year or two. And then the dot-com bust happened and then everyone fell, way farther behind. And so some of the legislative changes that have happened since then require you to keep making payments, even if you're over 100%, especially on the pension side. Because it's really a long-term, kind of strategy. It's never just a year over year decision frame. And so I think the idea here is just, making sure we're plugging away, making sure we have fixed, not fixed, but known payment levels in the next couple of years for budgeting purposes, making sure we're not falling too far behind that kind of, 50% corridor. So 67% to me is a good place to be.
Okay. And we have we use similar metrics to understand our pension fund with CalPERS but there the contributions are mandated. We don't have a discretion over how much we put into the CalPERS fund for pension.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's almost the exact same actuarial kind of look that the CalPERS will do. But instead of a recommendation, it is a mandate at that point. They require you and they charge you late fees if you don't do it, and that kind of a thing. So CalPERS will require you to fund the full amount each year. Whereas with this, you get an actuarial required amount, and then like I said, if you don't make that amount, then it starts to reflect poorly on your other kind of credit ratings agencies and that kind of a thing. But it's not legally required.
And are we in a good position with respect to the CalPERS pension fund?
Yeah, I'll have that here in 2 slides, but yes, we're in
Okay.
a very similar position, very similar, right in the mid 60% funded. And again, kind of slow and steady, we're on a good track.
Any specific concerns, Ranjiv, that you're
No,
seeing that I
trying
don't see?
to understand.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, it's tricky to understand because you said scale back. CalPERS actually dropped it to 0, as I recall, in that boom time.
Yes, CalPERS allowed that. Yeah, they call it, if you were in a super funded status, they didn't require a payment for that year. So they almost kind of engendered that behavior amongst all the public agencies. They said, hey, you get a free year. You don't owe us anything. And so many agencies said, great, we're not going to pay you anything. And then a year later, it was the exact opposite.
Yeah, which is, I recall what we did, if I remember right.
It's possible.
Where does this money live?
This money lives with CalPERS. CalPERS administers this trust as another kind of one of their investment arms. And so they give us 2 or 3 options on kind of the overall kind of risk tolerance you want. I think it's like a 6.5%, a 5.5%, and a 4% annual return. We've been choosing 6.5% since it started, and we haven't changed that. It's worked out pretty well for us given our investment horizon, but CalPERS manages it.
So that's an estimate.
Yeah, that's the they design their portfolio to try to attain 6.5. So it's still very safe investments underneath it all. It's a different portfolio than they use for their pension side, right? The pension side has much more risk to it. They're trying to get return.
Yes.
On this one. It's much safer, but it's still kind of in that 6.5 or 4% corridor.
Yeah, I would imagine the pension one is much larger than this fund too.
Much larger, yes.
And that spike in 20, whatever it is, 21, that's return on investment from them.
Yes, that was like a 20% investment return year, followed by a negative, 15 or whatever it was. So it was a one-time spike at the end of that year, right after all the stimulus payments went out and the stock market was going crazy.
And we have the option of funding more. You think that's not a good idea, or? This is the term you were after was unfunded. That's what people call it. I don't like that term.
Yeah. But it sounds like, Brad had already indicated that at 60, we're at a good position with 67% funded.
Yeah, our consumers may not feel the same.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, we have a MOU component that's going to play into this at some point, right? With retiree healthcare, that's going to help hopefully bend the curve the other direction.
Yes.
And so maybe not bend the trajectory of our investment, but increase the percentage of funding, I'm assuming.
Long way of saying yes. So we made a change to our retiree healthcare plans, an agreed upon change in our MOU, as you mentioned, and which created essentially a second tier for employees hired after January 2024. And so this doesn't quite reflect that yet because we don't have any employees that have landed in that tier yet. And so the actuaries are pretty strict about, kind of going just on what they're seeing in the sense of, the experience. But the idea there is as we start to get people under that plan and they'll start to see, their expected benefits in the future, any employee that we have, starting after 2024, which will be in the next cycle, if their profile, to simplify it, their profile and their future costs will be less than they were, the year before. So you start to have 5, 10, 20, 50 employees under that kind of, lower cost profile, then it's going to overall kind of start to lower your future liabilities. And you still have the same assets on hand. So essentially you'll start to close that gap, right?
Yep. Any future projections where that gap starts closing at all?
We haven't seen it yet. So we asked last summer if they could start to give us that projection. They said, since they don't have any employees currently in that, they didn't want us, they
Understood.
could do kind of a, an initial estimate for us, but they said they'll start to look at it once they see kind of, a couple employees in there and they can kind of run it through their models and see what that looks like over 30 years. Then they can start to extrapolate it more, once we have a couple of employees that are, covered in the plan. So I think the next actuarial will start to look at that for us.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, so pensions. So we started talking about pensions as well here. So this is a kind of, maybe a little bit of repeat, but with retiree pensions, we currently have an asset balance with CalPERS. So that was your question there, Director Kush, of over 196 million. So it's 4 times the size or so of, almost 5 times the size of our OPEB trust. We've been enrolled in CalPERS for many more years than we have in our OPEB trust. So you expect that over time. Similarly, they've gotten us a return of 7% over the last 20 years, so a relatively solid return. And I think I think amongst our customers, as we started talking about this, Director Russell mentioned this a minute ago. I think 10 years ago or so, there was a lot of speculation, especially after the last recession. Not speculation, but kind of criticism of CalPERS overstating their ability to get returns. I think they had a 7.75, expectation of returns. And I think that was a big part of the criticism was, the private sector said you can't expect 7% a year, you're kind of underfunded. And they were expecting all public agencies to be 100% funded and to use a much lower discount rate. So I think it's good to just be able to just talk about this and say, hey, CalPERS does get us 7% over the last 20 years and over the long term. So 7% is a pretty reasonable number to expect with CalPERS. It's not necessarily cooking the books. It's not, hiding obligations. We're actually doing pretty well through CalPERS, and they do a pretty good job with the entire state of California's investments for pensions. So 7% return over the past 20 years, and I'll talk in a minute about what that's done to their expectations in terms of what they shoot for in terms of their annual discount rate. They have an actuarial arm within CalPERS. They do this actuarial analysis for us. So unlike OPEB, where we have to go find our own actuary and we have to kind of do our own analysis with them, CalPERS provides this for us. They have a whole team of actuaries and they give us a report every year. It's the reports we do get are a year behind, so it takes them a while to go through it all. So it's always a year of a lag, but nonetheless, it's still a good standard report. And you can look at any public agency's actuarial report. It's all online, as ours is. And so if you need help sleeping at night, you can definitely peruse through the CalPERS websites. PEPRA is huge on this. So the second bullet there, Public Employee Pension Reform Act, PEPRA, that was enacted in 2013. And that was, again, another result of the 2012 recession or 2008 recession. And it really was a response to, all the public agencies that had a lot of money in CalPERS during the time when the market was really, really, drastically down during those years, minus 20% or so. That really had a vast impact on the required contributions. And we just talked about that, where CalPERS says, now you owe us for all the market losses. That happened almost immediately. And that was breaking the backs of cities and towns across California, because not only were they losing sales tax revenue and property tax revenue in the recession, but then they were kind of getting the double whammy here by having to pay more in pensions to make up for the investment losses. So PEPRA was actually a legislation passed in 2013, guided by the League of Cities and guided by the governor at the time, to really kind of start to put a cap on how expensive pensions could be for local agencies. The basic tenets of PEPRA or that the funding formula is that the costs are evenly split between the employer and the employee. Before that, many employers had negotiated and or kind of had the past practice of covering more than the employee share. So this kind of made it a fair 50-50 split. I would put a little caveat to that, that's 50-50 split on the expected normal costs going forward. The employer, in our case, the district, we still bear all of the risk for investment losses, right? So we can't charge our employees if investment losses are happening. We have to make up all the difference there. But the expected costs going forward in a perfect world, if everything works out as planned, those costs we split with PEPRA employees. So for any new employee that started after 2013 that's under PEPRA, we share the kind of the future costs 50-50. And the benefit formula also changed, and by changed it means it got less less beneficial for the employee. So it extended out retirement age for non-safety folks to 62, the normal retirement age. So Whereas, some agencies had 55 or 57, or some had 60. It pushed out to 62. So to get full retirement benefits, you'd have to be 62 years old to retire. And it also changed the formula down to a 2% of your salary. And so that essentially was about a 25% reduction in the overall benefit formula. So it really makes a big change over the long term to require at least 5 to 7 more years of working for each employee before they can pull their full benefits, and also to cut the overall benefit payments down by 25%. So it's a very big change.
It also capped the maximum payout on retirement as well.
Yes, it did. So for higher earning employees, you don't get the full cap of your salary. There's a cap on how much can be essentially attributed towards your pension. So it was really a way to kind of keep some of the highest paid employees from kind of,
With those,
benefiting off that.
do we stop paying into PERS for an employee once they reach their cap during the year?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. As the employee also stops paying, the employee stops matching as well. But yeah, once you hit that cap, it just gets shut off till the end of the year. So it's obviously it was going to take time to get more employees under this program. But this year, the last actuarial we got, we actually crossed the halfway point threshold, meaning that half of our employees we have now are covered under PEPRA. The other half are still under the classic plan. And so that really starts to change the future costs going forward. And so we're starting to see the benefits of that. And it's small percentages, but you're starting to see that little by little in each year's kind of actuarial return. And so in general, that is helping limit our costs going forward. And this is the CalPERS investment return history. So you can see here, it really is kind of an up and down type of a thing. CalPERS has a much wider risk tolerance on purpose. They are looking for long-term returns. And so when it's good, it's good. You can see the high years I've highlighted there, 18% back in 07, almost 21% in 2012, over 21% in 2021. That's the one we looked at with OPEB. And then last year they got 9.3%. So generally speaking, when it's good, they do a good job of getting returns. The hard part is those down years, right? And so that negative 23.6 that you see down there on the far left, that's what caused PEPRA. That's what caused the reaction. Because once the market lost so much in 2009, it was the 2011 kind of time to pay CalPERS, and that was when the bills just went through the roof, even with those returns that were pretty healthy in 2010 and 11. So that's really was the impetus for PEPRA. It's a little bit hard to see on this chart, but you can see the dotted line I have there. That's CalPERS expected return history. So forever it had been not forever, but for most recent history, it had been 7.75%, meaning that CalPERS was telling everyone that we think we can make every year 7.75% in the market. And that's what was kind of a cause, one of the big causes of concern for a lot of the pension critics, was they thought that was overly high and they thought that was unattainable. And I do think that, in many of the private pensions, they were expecting something more in the 2%, 3%, and 4%. So it really was about double what you would see on the private sector side. With PEPRA and with a lot of the changes they've enacted in their funding policy, they lowered that to 7.5% right around 2015. You can see they lowered it again to 7% in 2021, and then they just recently lowered again in 2022 down to 6.8%. So those may seem small, but that's them inching their expected return down over time, which lets them take safer investments underneath it all to make their number. What it really does for us is that it changes how much we have to pay. We as a district, we have to pay the difference. So rather than assuming, where it was 7.75%, that the market will return that over the long term, now we're a full percent below that, or 6.8%. So that's what's kind of been keeping our payments up, is that we're expected to make up the difference over the long term in just cash contributions as opposed to investment returns. And so it's really, kind of kept the benefit away from the district, in the sense of, our payments haven't gone down necessarily. What does go down is the kind of the overall volatility, though, because once they have a lower expected return, then it's easier for them to make their investments more stably. And then also the years that are low for us, like you can look at last year's returns, not 9.3, but the year before, that was around 5%. So a 5% return is only 1.5% or so away from their target. And so that's actually not a terrible outcome. But the farther you get away from the target, that's when you start to get the impact back on our books. And so when they have a lower target, it makes it kind of easier for us to absorb the bad years of investments, is kind of what I'm trying to say. So it does make it more predictable for us, and it does make it easier for CalPERS to make their kind of target over the long term. But we have had to pay for that in the meantime. So kind of just a long way of showing here that we are kind of the victims of CalPERS in many ways, in the sense that we don't get to control their policies, and we just have to react to what's happening, not only in the market, but in their funding policies. Generally speaking, the last couple of years have been good in the sense that the good years have been balanced off mostly by the bad years. But it is something worth noting when you have a year like 2022 where you're down 6.1%. We may think of that as, oh, we lost 6.1% in the market, but we're actually 6.1% plus the 6.8% we needed to make. So it's actually a 12%, or 13% shortfall from what the target was. And so the way CalPERS does this, just as a final comment here, and they've also added a 5-year smoothing policy to their investment returns. So they no longer require you to immediately make up any losses in the market. They put that on kind of a 5-year phased in approach. And so you're kind of always looking at the last 5 years together, what the cumulative kind of impact is of 5 total years. So mostly over the 5 years, they tend to even out. You can kind of see here any given 5-year period, you have a high and a low and 2 or 3 right around the mark. And so yeah, they're getting better and better at giving us good projections over the next 5 years. And if you really want to dig into this, you can kind of get a good sense for where we should be in the next year. And just by knowing the last 4 to 5 years of returns will be the lion's share of kind of what you're about to pay for. And then any 1 year is just 1/5 of kind of the overall impact. So it's getting a little bit easier to predict than it was maybe 10 years ago when it was more of a year by year type of an impact. Now, that was a lot to kind of go through there, but any questions on CalPERS for investment returns? Okay, so the impact of all that is this. So this the unfunded accrued liability, the UAL payment. So this is the one that the employer, meaning the district in this case, we are on the hook for fully. So we have to pay this part. And this is the difference. Essentially, it's the difference between the stock market gains and losses for what they expect to happen. There also is parts in here that are folded in for demographic changes when they do mortality studies, or they do, every 5 years they do an experience study, meaning how much are people actually making, how long are people actually living, and kind of some of those longer term assumptions. So if they make a change in assumptions, we have to kind of pay the difference in this unfunded liability payment, but it's more largely driven by market returns. And so for budget planning purposes, which is why this is on here, you can kind of see that this has been creeping up on us the last couple of years from, 4 million a year to 8 million a year to 10 million a year. Going forward, because of the last couple of years of losses, they're already telling us we can expect that to keep going up to 11 to 12 to 13 over the next 4 or 5 years. So this is what I have to put into the budget and what we have to start thinking about for rate planning, purposes going forward. The 5 years out there are in gray for a reason because those aren't finalized yet. That's just them saying if we get exactly what we expect in the next 2 years or 5 years, this is where the payments will be. I think going back to this slide here, we saw there's a 9.3% there on the far right. And so, without being an actuary, that tells me that some of those gray bars will come down a little bit, but that also will be offset depending on how this year goes and how next year goes. So I'm just putting this up here to let the board and the public know we're folding these in. These are part of kind of the back end budget planning process in terms of fund balancing over the long term. I'm looking at 26 and 27 right now for the budget, and then we'll be looking at 28, 29, and 30 in the next rate cycle, just to make sure we have that as a layer of fixed costs that we can't avoid in the budget as kind of one of the building blocks for the overall expenses.
You say we're folding it in. How are we folding it in?
I mean, folding it in meaning like when I make the financial plan, it's like we're looking at the 4 or 5 big inputs, and this becomes a pretty big input. So that just, becomes one of the base layers of the overall budget. And then
Yeah, but this is debt, right? Potentially.
It's required payments. So it's long-term debt in the CalPERS world, but for us, it's annual required payments, the cash that has to go out the door. So for budget purposes, this is just, we have to budget $11 million, just like debt service, right? Debt service has to go out.
An
CalPERS
expense, it's
payments
a
have to
cost
go
of
out.
doing business.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But I like the phrase experience study. I just hope that no one does that one on me anytime soon. But looking at this here, and I think where I get interested in is when does PEPRA start bending this down? How many, are we looking at 10, 15 years out, or is this something that is going to come out to these gray bars now?
So Pepper's already in this. Pepper's already bending this down. So I think
In terms of when it goes the other way.
I guess all I can say is, if we didn't have Pepper, these would all be bigger. That's the idea, right? So it's like they already know that half of our employees are Pepper and half are not, and so that's folding into their overall kind of expectations going forward. What Pepper does is it kind of keeps the future, when we don't have a good investment return, like I said, the volatility is lower, so it keeps the impact lower going forward for us. But generally speaking, they would just all be higher if we didn't have Pepper, 10 years of Pepper already. It's baked into all of this already.
Okay.
And the questions on pensions before we go? Okay, last topic here, last big line item. So we're basically talking about the 3 or 4 biggest line items in the budget. We talked about COLAs, we talked about health insurance and pensions. The next one is on our operations and materials side of the house. So I kind of spun the pie chart around this time here. So again, it's the same 3 different chunks of the budget there. Within operations and materials, our water purchases are by far the largest line item in that category. You can see their electricity, which we talked about briefly last month, is also their paving contracts, chemicals, and insurance. But by far and away, water purchases is the biggest line item here. So I think the board may be aware we purchase water from Sonoma County. Sonoma County gives charges to 9 different cities and water districts in the North Bay. They serve over 600,000 residents in the North Bay. They set their budget each year, and then depending the charges going out to each of the 9 cities, including us, the water district, are established by contractual formulas, and they're based on how Sonoma Water sets their budget. Recent rate increases, as I'll show here, have been much higher than the historical trend. And so that's something, again, that plays into our budget planning going forward. And so this is the unit costs that we've gotten from Sonoma County Water Agency over the last 10 years. And so when they're charging us for their water, they're giving us a unit cost price, meaning $1 per acre foot. That we use. And then the second point of that, as I'm sure the board is aware, is how much we use is more up to us, right? We have a minimum take or pay currently of 5,300, and then we can go up from there depending on how much we need to use. So if you look at the unit costs here, back in 2016, we were under 1,000. We were at $927 per acre foot from Sonoma Water. And then the bars above there are showing the annual, or the line chart going across there shows the annual percentage change in the costs from Sonoma Water. So we had a couple years there in their kind of that mid 20-teen drought, 2016, 2017, where our rates went up 6 and 7%. And then for, 2019, 2021, and 22, we were all under 5%, 3%, 3%, 5%, 4%. So that was kind of the expected range going forward. And I think they do what they can to try to keep their contracting agencies in that range of, 5% or less. That changed dramatically in 2024, as you can see. That went from, the 5% range to 11%. Last year for the 2025 rates, the ones we're paying now, was a 10% increase. And then based on what they currently have in their budget and then their final negotiations in terms of unit prices, we're looking at about an 8.8% increase going forward based on the draft budget. So that's going to put us about $1,752 or $1,752 per acre foot from Sonoma. So it's really been a big increase the last couple of years. So that, again, this is something, we don't know, except for year by year, we don't get as much long-term guidance from Sonoma. They have a lot of, factors to balance on their own. They have demand overall, they have their costs, and we're one of 9, as I mentioned, agencies that are contracting with them. So it is a good group effort there, but, at the end of the day, it still is a budgeted cost for us. We do have a minimum amount we have to purchase from them of this, and that's going up faster than we had necessarily planned for 2 to 3 years ago. So it is something we have to adjust for in the budget and certainly in future rate cycles. And so I think I have in the staff report that this last increase, just if we kind of apply that to our current 5,300 acre feet, that makes about a $750,000 kind of increase to our budget, more than we would have expected if prices had been flat. So again, these are, talk about the health increase, talk about the pensions. These are all, multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars that go into it. They are a cost of doing business. They are beyond our control, but it is something that we, especially as we set the budget, we have to at least plan for and make sure there's sufficient funds for. Particularly as it comes to purchase water, because that is a key part of our overall water supply. 25% of our water does come from Sonoma County. They're long-term partners with us, but it does have a cost.
Right, despite these cost increases, the year to date, at least for this fiscal year, we're still under budget when we look at our expenses.
Yes, and so I think part of the, I don't want to say lessons learned, but part of the strategy for going into this last budget cycle was to not budget the minimum anymore, right? I think we had been kind of, by practice, we had budgeted just the 5,300 acre feet each year. And then when we went over, we had to use reserves to kind of make up that difference. And so I think for this last 2-year budget, and we'll kind of talk about the next 2-year budget, we budgeted a little bit more, right? So in the 6,000 to 7,000 range, knowing that we might need to use it. We've been very fortunate now the last 2 or 3 years where we've been spilling, we've been able to use the minimum each year. So we've had a natural savings there for sure. And I want to say right now, we haven't even used our full allocation. I think we're still in the mid 4,000s, maybe 4,500 acre feet or so we've taken from Sonoma. So we will take the remaining minimum over the summer, or closer probably to June, I would assume, after we're done spilling. And so there will be a savings. So we've been budgeting more than the minimum, but we still have to kind of decide what's the right level going forward, and then at the very least have the minimum, plus these cost increases. So it's not a budget impact for this year. It's more for the long-term planning and the long-term kind of trends on this item.
Yeah, I think it's important for the public to know and just everyone in the room that Sonoma is going through kind of a financial set of fixes in much the way that we did in this board, in this agency 2 years ago. They have had some real difficulties, and they're catching up. And they're doing it, as you can see, over the last few years. And these are not easy decisions for them. The contractors are extremely thoughtful about making sure they don't get overcharged. These are pretty thoughtful negotiations. And we do have a meeting coming up with the Sonoma WAC where we will be reviewing the next increases in the fees. But these get passed on to our customers in a sense. This is the core of the extra water that we need for in drought years, and this is expensive water. So this is a very important part of our financial model and planning.
So that wraps up my report for today. To recap it, we're pretty much complete with all the individual department reviews of the budget. We're trying to finalize our cost estimates for the larger items. We still have PG&E, chemicals, and insurance to finalize, and those will come in the next coming months. I think chemicals will get the final word closer to end of May. Insurance, we should get our first quote here in the next month or so. And PG&E takes a while to unravel, but we have a good placeholder for now, but we'll have to take a look at the summer rates there. So those will be the next 3 big ones coming your way in terms of updates. Capital project planning is underway. We are currently kind of finalizing our initial draft of the capital project budget to incorporate capital projects, water supply, and deferred maintenance. That's going to come back to the board in April, I believe, at a planning meeting. We'll get our first look at that at the end of April. We're gonna have a budget workshop for the board in May 2025, and that's where we'll kind of recap a lot of these larger operating items, capital items, and some of the individual department issues. And then we'll finalize our revenue projections right around then as well. And then we'll bring all that back to the board for consideration in June 2025. And that completes my report. I'm happy to take any additional questions.
Great. Diana?
No questions. Thank you.
Brett, thank you very much for the report. As part of the budget workshop in May, and then prior to the bringing to us in the board, are we going to have how much surplus, or if you anticipate a surplus in this year's operating budget? Will that be known at that time for us as well? And then discussion how we want to move on that money if it is significant?
Yeah, I think so. I'd like to kind of, because I see those two kind of hand in hand in the sense of, how we're ending one year becomes how you jump off for the next year. Plus, similar to last year, I assume I know there will be some level of surplus. So it's just a matter of, does that change? How does that change how we program our reserves for the year? Does that, give us an opportunity to set aside funds for future needs? And then does that also change maybe how much reserves we need to plan for in the future? Because the board may recall that we have currently within our budget and our financial plan to, proactively contribute to reserves.
Yep.
And so if we're getting to a point where we may be able to dial that, kind of refine that a little bit, that becomes part of the decision factor there. And I think
It would be helpful just to understand.
One,
Go
as
for it,
an
Ben.
example, and it's a good question, and we do plan to have the discussion with the board. One idea we're going to bring is the concept of, do we start with a modest contribution to a building fund, for example? And we've talked about this facility, watershed facility. So we'll have an opportunity to have that discussion.
Great, thank you.
Great. Ranjit?
No more questions, Brett. Thanks for the really helpful overview. Every time I hear this, I hopefully learn a little bit more, and I'm looking forward to the budget discussions. As I said earlier, it's really encouraging to see that our actuals are quite close to the forecasts that were made, now a couple of years ago. So good job on that. Thank you.
I join in thanking you. That was an excellent presentation. Keep in mind, though, that we still have that arbitrary number of 5 million a year towards the reserves. So there's some flexibility there too. You know, there's no guide on how the reserve should be refunded. So there's some ability to move money around that we can use. But yeah, it was a very nice presentation, especially the part on the unfunded liability. I don't like that term because in business, all going forward costs are unfunded. You know, our power bills unfunded, our, you know, building facilities, things are unfunded until you get to them. So I think it's a kind of an arbitrary way of looking at it that they've utilized. However, it is a hot topic, especially in the Tiburon Peninsula, where people primarily make their living out of pushing money. They pay a lot of attention to those kind of things. As you may remember, I told the story about a gentleman I was having breakfast with who decided that because of the changes in the economy, he had to get rid of his second jet. And we then had the conversation about pensions. And, you know, the average pension, as I recall, is something like 60,000 a year here.
According to the last report, is 44,000, 43 or
44.
44, yeah.
And I kind of went like, and you have to get rid of your second jet.
Yeah.
Kind of keep things in perspective. You know, we're talking about, because of the multiples, it's a fair amount of money, but the individual benefit is fairly minimal.
Yeah.
And I think I made some ground with him because he hasn't whined about it since then, at least not in my face.
It's hard to understand. There's a lot going into it, and you hear a lot of things in the headlines. And you know, like you said, the combination of the multiples is a lot of money. But at the end of the day, there's some reality there too.
Especially when people are talking about their second jet.
Thanks, Brett. I also want to thank you for the thoughtful report and update on some of the inflationary factors that impact our budgeting. I am keenly focused on making sure that we don't need a giant rate increase again when we get to our next setting in 18 months, or probably starting to work on that with this budget. I'm hoping that we can keep it tight and that we'll be super conservative as we go through this budgeting process, and that we don't need to have another shock to the system for our customers. So I look forward to a conservative, thoughtful set of decisions that we make on the expense front. And I appreciate the fact that we do have these reserves and that we've set this agency up to have much better financial stability than it has had in a long time. So I appreciate the report, and I'm looking forward to the next steps. So thank you. Any public comment?
There are none.
Okay, terrific. All righty, now we'll go on to our upcoming meetings, please.
Yes, the next duly noticed FAC board meeting is on April 24th.
Terrific. And we will adjourn. Thank you very much, everybody.